The throne room was silent in a way that Marcus had learned to recognize as dangerous. He stood among the Queen's advisors and watched the faces of the Velith nobles as they processed what their ruler had just announced. And he could see the shock, and the outrage, and the fear rippling through the ancient aristocracy like waves through still. Water Queen Sereth Val had just proposed the unthinkable. She wanted to end the tribute system that had governed relations between the Velith and the Calith and the lesser species for 10,000 years. And she wanted to offer humanity not subjugation, but alliance. And she wanted to treat the broken, scarred species that had been brought before her as an insult as equal partners in the governance of the stars. Court did not know how to respond. Your Majesty, Lord Tethrisvane said carefully, and he was the oldest of the surviving nobles, and his voice carried the weight of millennia. Surely this is a jest or a test of our loyalty, because what you propose is impossible. I do not jest, the Queen replied. And her voice was calm, but Marcus could hear the steel beneath it. And I do not test because I am deadly serious. The humans are primitives. Another noble protested. They have been in space for less than 300 years, and they still die of old age, and they cannot regenerate. And they scar and break, and they are everything we are not. Yes, the Queen agreed. They are everything we are not, and that is exactly why we need them. She rose from her throne and descended the steps, and the nobles drew back as she passed, because there was something in her eyes that they had never seen before. I have ruled this empire for 3,000 years, she said, and her voice filled the crystal chamber. And I have watched us slowly die. The court shifted uncomfortably, because these were words that were never spoken aloud. Our birth rates fall every century, and our innovation has stagnated for 5,000 years, and we build the same ships and the same weapons and the same cities that our ancestors built, because we have no need to create anything new. She stopped in the center of the room and turned slowly to look at all of them. We won every war and mastered every challenge and conquered every enemy. And we became so perfect that we forgot how to struggle, and a species that cannot struggle cannot grow. She gestured at Marcus without looking at him. The humans were brought to us as an insult because they are damaged and scarred and mortal and imperfect. But they have survived everything the universe has thrown at them, and they have never stopped fighting and never stopped creating and never stopped reaching for more. Her voice softened but somehow carried even further. They lost 1,000 battles and learned from every defeat and came back stronger each time, and they turned their weaknesses into weapons and their scars into armor, and they accomplished in 300 years what took us 10,000. Lord Tethrisvane stepped forward, and his ancient face was troubled. Even if what you say is true, and even if the humans have value, what you propose would upend the entire structure of our society. And the lesser species would see it as weakness, and our enemies would see it as opportunity. Our enemies are dead, the Queen replied, and there was ice in her voice. Vithras Khan and his followers learned what happens when human tactics are turned against those who refuse to adapt. And I do not intend to make the same mistake. She walked back to her throne, but did not sit. The universe is vast and ancient and full of terrors we have not yet imagined, and there are things in the dark spaces between galaxies that even we do not understand. She looked out at her court, and her galaxy-filled eyes seemed to hold visions of futures that only she could see. When those terrors come, and they will come eventually, I want humanity standing beside us, and not because they are forced to serve, but because they choose to fight, and that choice makes all the difference. The nobles were silent, and Marcus could see them struggling with ideas that challenged everything they had believed for thousands of years. I do not offer alliance because humans are strong, the Queen continued. I offer it because they make us stronger, and because their chaos complements our order, and because their creativity fills the gaps in our perfection. She finally sat upon her throne, and her expression was resolute. The tribute system ends today, and any noble house that refuses to accept this new reality will find themselves facing the same tactics that destroyed Vithras Khan. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and no one dared to speak. "You are all dismissed," the queen said, except for Commander Cole. The nobles filed out in stunned silence, and soon Marcus was alone with the queen in the vast crystal chamber. "You have changed everything," he said when the doors had closed behind the last of them. "You changed everything." She corrected, "I merely recognized what you had to offer." She descended from her throne once more and approached him. And when she spoke, her voice was soft and almost gentle. "You were offered to me as an insult and a broken remnant of a lesser species, and I looked at you, and I saw what my people have forgotten how to see." "What was that?" Marcus asked. The queen smiled, and it was warm and terrible and full of something that might have been hope. Potential. She reached out and touched his face, and her fingers traced the scar on his cheek that the Velith medicine had not been able to erase. Every scar is a story of survival, and every survival is proof that the universe cannot break you, and that is the most powerful thing in existence. Marcus felt something shift inside him, and he realized that he was no longer a prisoner or a tribute or even a guest. With something new, he was the first bridge between two species that had nothing in common except the will to survive. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we build something that has never existed before," the queen replied. "An alliance based on mutual strength rather than dominance, and a partnership that combines our perfection with your chaos." She walked to the window and looked out at her crystal kingdom. "It will not be easy, and my people will resist, and your people will not trust us, and there will be those on both sides who would rather see us fail than succeed together. But we will try anyway." Marcus said, "Yes." The queen agreed, because that is what survivors do. She turned to face him one last time. "You taught me that even broken things can be beautiful, and that scars are not weakness but proof of strength, and that the universe favors those who refuse to give up. What did I teach you about humanity?" Marcus asked. The queen smiled that beautiful, terrible smile. "That you are unacceptable by every measure we have ever used, and that is exactly what makes you essential." She extended her hand, and Marcus took it, and two species that should have been enemies became something else entirely. And far away in the darkness between galaxies, something ancient stirred and turned its attention toward the small bright cluster of stars, where humanity and the Velith were learning to stand together. The real test was still coming, but when it arrived, they would be ready, because survivors always found a way, and humanity had never been anything else. I was offered to the alien queen as tribute. She looked at me and whispered, "Unacceptable. The Battle of the Shattered Moons would be remembered as the day the Velith learned what humans were truly capable of." Lord Vithras Khan had gathered his fleet in the Sarah system, where 7 moons orbited a dead gas giant, and the debris field between them provided perfect cover for his hit-and-run tactics. Had positioned his warships with mathematical perfection, and his formations were elegant and deadly, and every ship knew exactly where to be and what to do. And he was confident that the Queen's forces would fall into his trap. Expected them to approach in the traditional Velith formation and engage his fleet in the ancient dance of plasma fire and shield harmonics, and he expected to bleed them slowly and retreat before they could land a killing blow. He did not expect them to run. The Queen's fleet emerged from hyperspace and immediately turned and fled toward the asteroid field surrounding the system's outer planets, and their formation broke apart, and ships scattered in every direction, and it looked like complete chaos. Vithras Khan watched from his command ship, and he smiled, because this was better than he had hoped, and the Queen's forces were clearly in disarray, and his victory would be swift and total. "Pursue them," he commanded. "Do not let them escape." His fleet surged forward and chased the fleeing enemy ships into the asteroid field, and his commanders were eager for the kill. and no one stopped to wonder why the Queen's fleet had led them to this particular location. Marcus watched from the Queen's command ship as the trap closed. He had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment and teaching the Velith commanders tactics they found disgusting and planning operations that violated every rule of elegant warfare. The asteroids in this field had been modified. Salvage teams had fitted them with emergency thrusters from damaged ships and packed them with explosive compounds and hidden them among millions of identical rocks, and now they waited like sleeping predators for their prey to stumble into their midst. Now, Marcus said. The Queen gave the signal, and the asteroids came alive. Thrusters fired, and rocks that had drifted peacefully for millions of years suddenly accelerated toward the rebel fleet, and Vithriscan's commanders had only seconds to realize what was happening before the first impacts. The elegant Velith formations dissolved into chaos as ships tried to evade asteroids that were actively hunting them, and the careful spacing that made their fleet so deadly in traditional combat became a death sentence as rocks slammed into ships that could not maneuver without hitting their neighbors. And then the Queen's fleet turned. They did not attack the main body of the rebel fleet because that was what Vithriscan expected, and instead they struck at his support ships and his communication relays and his ammunition carriers and everything that kept his fleet operational. Marcus had called it cutting the tendons, and the Velith commanders had not understood until they saw it in action. A warship without ammunition was useless, and a fleet without communication was blind, and an army without supplies was already dead. And Vithriscan watched his perfect formation fall apart as the support structure that held it together was systematically destroyed. This is not how war is fought. He screamed at his commanders. They cannot do this, and we did not agree to fight this way. But the Queen's forces did not care about agreements, and they did not care about elegance, and they did not care about the ancient traditions of Velith warfare. They cared about winning. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, half of Vithriscan's fleet was destroyed, and the other half was scattered and fleeing, and the rebel lord himself was dead in the wreckage of his command ship. Still screaming that this was not fair, the Queen stood on her bridge and watched the debris field that had once been an enemy fleet, and her expression was unreadable. Your species weaponizes everything, she said to Marcus. Rocks and chaos, and even running away. We had to, Marcus replied. We were never the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, and we survived because we refused to accept the rules of any game we could not win. The Queen turned to face him, and her galaxy-filled eyes held something that might have been awe. I have ruled for 3,000 years, and in all that time no one has ever surprised me, and no one has ever shown me something truly new. She gestured at the destruction visible through the viewports. This is horrifying and brutal and completely without elegance. Marcus nodded because she was right. And it is the most effective military operation I have ever witnessed. The Queen continued, more effective than any battle in 40,000 years of Velith history. She was quiet for a moment. You are unacceptable, Marcus Cole, and you break every model and violate every expectation and everything I thought I knew about warfare and strength and power. I am sorry, Marcus said because he did not know what else to say. Do not be sorry, the Queen replied, and there was something almost like warmth in her voice. Be proud, because you have done something that no one else in the history of my empire has ever done. What is that? The Queen smiled, and it was beautiful and terrible, and full of something that Marcus could not name. You have taught the Velith how to survive. She turned back to watch the debris field and the scattered remnants of the rebel fleet. The war is not over, but it will be soon, and when it ends things will be different, and I will need you to help me decide what that difference will look like. Marcus stood beside the ancient Queen and watched the aftermath of human warfare written across the stars, and he wondered what he had set in motion and whether it will ultimately be a blessing or a curse. But That was a problem for another day today. He had survived, and so had the queen, and sometimes that was enough. The remaining rebel houses surrendered within weeks, and the Civil War ended not with a glorious final battle, but with quiet capitulations and hasty peace offerings and noble lords who suddenly remembered their loyalty to the crown and threw it all the Veleth. Whispered about the human who had taught their queen how to fight dirty, and they did not know whether to fear him or admire him or both. Marcus did not care what they thought. He had done what he always did. He had survived, and he had helped others survive along with him, and in the end, that was the most human thing of all. The war began with a whisper. Marcus heard the servants talking in hushed voices about Lord Vithres Khan and his demands and his growing army of supporters, and he pieced together the story from fragments of conversation and worried glances. Vithres Khan was the noble who had demanded the tribute from the human colonies, and he had expected Marcus to be humiliated and executed, and his faction to gain power through the queen's disgust with humanity. Instead, the queen had called Marcus a survivor and kept him as a guest, and Vithres Khan had been made to look like a fool in front of the entire court. For a Veleth noble, there was no greater insult. Within a week, Vithres Khan had declared the queen unfit to rule and accused her of being contaminated by contact with lesser species, and a third of the noble houses had rallied to his banner, and the Veleth dominion was tearing itself apart. Marcus watched the news feeds in his quarters and saw crystal cities burning and elegant warships firing on each other, and he felt a strange mixture of horror and fascination, because he had never imagined that the perfect Veleth could destroy themselves so thoroughly. The queen did not visit him for 10 days, and when she finally came, she looked tired in a way that Marcus had not known immortal beings could look. "Your people fight civil wars," she said without greeting. "How do you survive them?" Marcus thought about the history he had learned in school and all the conflicts that had nearly ended humanity before it reached the stars. "We barely survived them," he admitted. "Civil wars are the worst kind of war because they tear apart everything that holds a society together. My generals tell me we will win within a month," the queen said, and she sat heavily in her chair. "They say our forces are stronger and our tactics are superior and our victory is certain. Do you believe them?" The queen was silent for a long moment. "They have never lost a battle," she finally said. "They do not know what it feels like to be wrong." Marcus understood what she was not saying, and he felt a chill run down his spine. "They do not know how to adapt," he said. "When things go wrong, they will follow their plans anyway, because they cannot imagine that their plans might fail." The queen nodded slowly. "Vithres Khan has hired mercenaries from the outer systems, and they do not fight the way Veleth fight, and my generals do not know how to respond." She looked at Marcus with those tired ancient eyes. "You have lost battles. It was not a question. Many times." Marcus said, "I have retreated and regrouped and changed my plans in the middle of a fight and done things that military manuals say you should never do." "And you survived?" "I survived." The queen stood and walked to the window, and Marcus could see the distant flashes of weapons fire in the night sky. "Come with me," she said. She led him through corridors he had never seen to a room filled with holographic displays and grim-faced Veleth commanders who looked at Marcus with barely concealed contempt. "Your Majesty," one of them said carefully, "surely you do not intend to bring the human into the War Council." "I intend to take counsel from someone who knows what it means to lose," the queen replied, and her voice was cold. "Something none of you have ever experienced." The commanders shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to argue. The queen gestured at the main display, which showed fleet positions and battle lines and strategic objectives. "Show him everything," she commanded, and so they did. Marcus studied the displays for a long time, and he asked questions that the commanders thought were foolish, and he made them explain things they thought were obvious, and slowly he began to understand the shape of The Queen's forces were larger and better equipped, but they were spread across multiple systems trying to defend everything at once, and Vithras Khan's fleet was smaller, but more concentrated, and they were using hit-and-run tactics that the Velith had never encountered. Your enemy is not trying to win a traditional war, Marcus finally said. He's trying to make you bleed, and every time you chase his fleet, they slip away and strike somewhere else. And your generals do not know how to fight an enemy who refuses to stand and die. The commanders bristled at his words, but the Queen leaned forward with interest. What would you do? She asked. Marcus looked at the displays again and thought about every desperate, ugly, creative thing humanity had ever done to survive. Stop chasing him, he said. Let him think he's winning and let him get confident and then hit him where he does not expect. That is not how war is conducted. One of the commanders protested. We must respond to his attacks and protect our territories and show strength. That is exactly what he wants you to do, Marcus replied. He wants you to spread your forces thin and react to his moves and exhaust yourselves chasing shadows while he chips away at your strength. He pointed to a system on the edge of the display. Where does Vithras Khan keep his supply? Ships? The commanders looked at each other uncertainly. We do not target supply lines, one of them said. That would be dishonorable. Marcus almost laughed. Your enemy is using mercenaries who do not fight by your rules, and you are still worried about honor? He looked at the Queen. You asked me what I would do, and I'm telling you, and you are not going to like it. The Queen's expression did not change. Tell me. Stop fighting the war he expects. Marcus said. Stop defending and start attacking, and not his fleet, but his support, and his supply lines, and his communication relays, and everything that lets him keep fighting. He drew lines on the display with his finger. Make him react to you. Instead of reacting to him, and when he moves to protect something, hit him somewhere else and never let him rest and never let him predict what you will do next. The commanders looked horrified. That is chaos. One of them said, that is not strategy, and it is not elegant, and it is not how the Velith wage war. You are right, Marcus agreed. It is how humans wage war, and it is ugly and brutal and dishonorable. And it works. The Queen was silent for a long time, and the commanders held their breath, and Marcus waited to see if he had just signed his own death warrant. Implement his suggestions. The Queen finally said. The commanders stared at her in disbelief. Your Majesty, one of them protested. This goes against everything we have ever. I did not ask for your opinion. The Queen interrupted, and her voice was sharp enough to cut. Crystal, I asked for victory, and if we continue fighting the way we have always fought, we will continue getting the results we have been getting, and I find those results unacceptable. She looked at Marcus, and there was something almost like hope in her ancient eyes. Teach them, she commanded. Teach them how humans fight. Marcus looked at the hostile faces of the Velith commanders and knew that the next few weeks would be the most difficult of his life, but he had survived worse. He always did. The eastern wing of the palace was larger than any building Marcus had ever lived in on Earth. His quarters had windows that looked out over crystal gardens where flowers, made of light, bloomed and faded with the movement of the twin suns, and the bed was so soft it felt like sleeping on clouds, and the food they brought him was strange but delicious, and his body began to heal in ways he had not thought possible. The Velith doctors came every day, and they regrew his missing arm with technology that seemed like magic, and they healed the infections that had festered in his wounds, and they looked at him with curiosity rather than contempt, and Marcus did not understand what was happening. He had been a prisoner and then a tribute, and now he was something else entirely, and nobody would tell him what that something was. The fifth night the Queen came to visit him. She arrived without guards or attendants, and she wore simple robes instead of royal finery, and she sat in a chair across from his bed and looked at him with those galaxy-filled eyes, and Marcus felt like he was being studied by something older than the stars. Do you know why I kept you? she asked, and her voice was softer than it had been in the throne room. Marcus shook his head because he had been asking himself that question every day. Neither do I, the Queen admitted, and there was something almost like wonder in her voice. I have not been surprised by anything in over 1,000 years, and then you stood before me, and I felt something I had forgotten how to feel. What was that? Marcus asked, curiosity. She said, and she leaned forward slightly. Tell me about Earth. And so Marcus told her. He told her about blue oceans and green forests and cities that reached toward the sky, and he told her about the way the sun looked when it set over the Pacific, and the sound of rain falling on rooftops and the smell of coffee in the morning. Told her about human history with all its wars and plagues and disasters, and he told her about how humanity had nearly destroyed itself 12 times and somehow kept surviving, and he told her about the day they finally reached the stars, only to discover they were not. Alone, the Queen listened without interrupting, and her eyes never left his face, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Your species lives for less than a century, she finally said, and there was something like disbelief in her voice. How do you accomplish anything at all when you have so little time? Marcus thought about the question because it deserved the real answer. Maybe that is why we accomplish things, he said slowly. Because we know we do not have forever and every moment matters, and we cannot afford to wait. The Queen considered this, and then she reached out and touched the new skin on his regrown arm, and her fingers were cold but gentle. Tell me about your scars, she said. The ones we could not heal. Marcus had scars that the Velith medicine could not erase because they were too old and too deep, and they had become part of who he was. There was the burn scar on his neck from a training accident when he was 20, and the knife wound on his ribs from a bar fight he should not have survived, and the shrapnel marks on his back from his first real battle, and dozens of others that told the story of his life. Each one is a lesson, he told her, a reminder of something I survived and something I learned. The Velith do not scar, the Queen said, and she had said this before, but now there was something different in her voice. When we are damaged, we regenerate perfectly, or we die, and we have always believed this made us better than the species that carry their wounds forever. She traced a scar on his forearm with one finger. But you carry your wounds with you always, and instead of breaking you, they make you stronger. And I do not understand how that is possible. Marcus thought about all the times he had wanted to give up, and all the reasons he had found to keep going. And he tried to put it into words that an immortal being might understand. When something breaks, use and we survive. We learn that we can survive, he said. And the next time something tries to break us, we remembered that we have been broken before, and we are still here, and that knowledge becomes armor. The Queen withdrew her hand and sat back in her chair, and her expression was troubled. My people have ruled this region of space for 40,000 years, she said quietly. We have never lost a war and never faced extinction and never truly struggled for survival. She looked at him, and there was something almost like fear in her ancient eyes. I am beginning to think that has made us weak. Marcus did not know what to say because he had never imagined that the Velith might have weaknesses, and he had certainly never imagined that their greatest weakness might be their perfection. We have forgotten what it means to fight for survival. The Queen continued, we win because we have always won, and we assume we will continue to win, and we have become complacent in our power. She stood and walked to the window and looked out at her crystal kingdom. Your species has been fighting for survival since the day you climbed down from the trees, she said. Every generation has faced challenges that threatened to destroy you, and every generation has found a way to overcome them. She turned to face him. That is why you scar and we do not. And I am no longer certain that our way is better, Marcus stood and walked to stand beside her at the window because he sensed that she needed something from him, even if she did not know what it was. Scars are not just lessons, he said. They are proof that the universe tried to break us and failed. And every time we survive something that should have killed, we become a little harder to kill. The Queen was silent for a long moment. I've watched my people slowly decline for the last 10,000 years. She finally said, our birth rates fall and our innovation stagnates, and we build the same things we have always built because we have no need to build anything new. She looked at Marcus with those galaxy-filled eyes. We are dying of our own perfection, and we do not even realize it. Marcus understood. Then why she had kept him, and why she visited him every night, and why she asked so many questions about humanity. She was looking for something that her people had lost. She was looking for the will to survive, Your Majesty, he said carefully. I am just a soldier, and I do not know if I can give you what you are looking for. The Queen smiled, and it was the saddest smile Marcus had ever seen. You have already given me more than you know, she said. You have shown me that there is another way to be strong, and that perfection is not the same as power. She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. The court believes I have kept you as a curiosity or a pet, she said without looking back. Let them believe that for now, because there are things happening in my empire that you do not yet understand, and I may need what you have to teach me sooner than either of us would like. She left, and Marcus stood at the window for a long time, watching the crystal flowers bloom and fade, and wondering what storms were gathering on the horizon. The prison ship smelled of metal and fear, and the strange perfume the Velith used to mask the scent of lesser species. Commander Marcus. Cole had stopped counting the days after the first month, because counting only made the waiting worse, and he had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing to carry in a cage. The Velith had captured him during the Battle of Proxima 7, when his destroyer had been cut in half by their plasma beams, and he had watched 47 of his crew die in the cold vacuum of space before the enemy boarding party had pulled him from the wreckage. They had taken his left arm below the elbow when the plasma fire had caught him, and the Velith medics had sealed the wound, but made no effort to regenerate what was lost, because humans were not worth the resources, and Marcus had learned to live with the phantom pain that haunted him every night. He was 34 years old, and he looked 50, and he knew he would probably never see Earth again. Selection came on what he guessed was his 93rd day of captivity. 2 Velith officers entered his cell, and they were tall and elegant, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that held distant stars, and they looked at him the way humans might look at an insect they were considering whether to crush. This one, the first officer said, and there was amusement in his voice that made Marcus want to break his perfect teeth. Are you certain? The second officer asked, and he was clearly trying not to laugh. He's damaged and scarred and barely functional. That is precisely why he is perfect. The first officer replied, Lord Vithras Khan demanded a tribute from the human colonies, and the Queen will see what worthless creatures these humans truly are when we present her with this broken specimen. Marcus did not react because he had learned that reacting only entertained them, and he refused to be entertainment. They cleaned him and dressed him in simple white cloth that felt like silk against his scarred skin, and they put him on a transport ship that carried him across 3 star systems to the crown world of Velis Prime. Marcus had heard stories about Velis Prime, but the stories had not prepared him for the reality. The Fainber. The stories had not prepared him for the stories had not prepared him for the reality. This planet was covered in crystal cities that caught the light of twin suns and scattered rainbows across the sky, and the Velith moved through their world like gods walking through paradise, and Marcus understood for the first time why they looked at humans with such contempt. Humanity had barely reached the stars, and the Velith had been building empires when human ancestors were still learning to use fire. The throne room of Queen Serethval was the most beautiful and terrifying place Marcus had ever seen. Crystal pillars rose toward a ceiling so high it might as well have been the sky in thousands. A Velith noble stood in perfect formations wearing clothes that cost more than human starships, and they all turned to watch as Marcus was led down the central aisle like a lamb being brought to slaughter, and at the far end of the room on a throne, carved from a single massive diamond, sat the queen. She was ancient in a way that made Marcus feel like a mayfly, and her skin was darker than midnight, and her eyes contained entire galaxies spinning slowly in their depths, and she watched his approach. With an expression he could not read, the officer who had selected him stepped forward and bowed so deeply his forehead nearly touched the floor. "Your Majesty," he announced in a voice that carried through the chamber, "I present to you the tribute demanded by the noble house of Vithris Khan from the human territories." A wave of murmuring passed through the court, and Marcus could hear their amusement and their contempt, and he stood there in his white cloth with his missing arm and his scars and his exhaustion, and he refused to lower his eyes. The queen rose from her throne. She was impossibly tall, and she moved with a grace that made walking look like dancing, and the court fell absolutely silent as she descended the steps and approached the tribute that had been brought before her. She circled him slowly, and her eyes catalogued every scar on his face and every mark of suffering on his body and every sign of the damage that captivity and war had inflicted upon him. Marcus kept his eyes forward and his spine straight because he was a commander of the Earth Defense Force, and he would not bow even if it killed him. The queen stopped directly in front of him, and she was so close he could smell something like starlight and winter and time itself. She leaned down, and her lips nearly brushed his ear, and she whispered a single word in a voice meant only for him. "Unacceptable." The court erupted. Marcus could hear the shock and the outrage and the fear in their voices, because a rejected tribute was an insult of the highest order, and it meant war and destruction for the faction that had sent him, and he braced himself for the execution that would surely follow. But the queen raised one long, elegant finger, and the silence that fell was absolute. "This tribute is unacceptable," she said, and her voice rang through the crystal chamber like a bell, "because it is an insult to believe that I would not recognize what stands before me." She turned to face her court, and Marcus saw something in her galaxy-filled eyes that made the ancient nobles take a step back. "You send me a broken creature and expect me to see worthlessness," she continued, and there was cold fury in her voice. "You expect me to look upon these scars and see failure and weakness and everything you believe the lesser species to be." She gestured at Marcus without looking at him. "But I have lived for 3,000 years, and I have watched civilizations rise and fall, and I know what survival looks like." The queen walked back toward her throne, and every eye in the room followed her. "The Velith do not scar," she said, and she turned to face the court once more. "When we are damaged, we regenerate perfectly, or we die because there is no middle ground for our kind, and we have always believed this made us superior." She looked at Marcus, and her expression was something he had never seen on a Velith face before. "But this human has been burned and broken and starved and imprisoned, and he stands before me unbowed with his wounds displayed like medals and his eyes full of defiance." The queen sat upon her throne, and her voice softened but somehow carried even further. "You have not sent me a worthless specimen," she smiled, and it was beautiful and terrible. "You have sent me a survivor." The court did not know how to respond, and Marcus did not know what was happening, and the silence stretched until it became something heavy and dangerous. "Take him to the eastern wing," the queen commanded. "See that he is fed and healed, and give him quarters befitting a guest of the crown." Guest, not a servant or a slave or a tribute, but a guest. Marcus felt something shift in the room, and he knew that whatever happened next would change everything, and he still did not lower his eyes as the guards led him away from the throne and into an uncertain future.